The rhythmic tap of a gold pen against mahogany echoed through the glass-walled boardroom, cutting through the low hum of city traffic outside. Victor Adeyemi stood at the head of the table, his gaze locking onto each of his 4 children in turn. They shifted in their seats. Kayode leaned back, eyes scanning the ceiling. Adana tapped her phone screen with rapid, impatient motions. Chinedu slumped, his chin resting on his palm. Victor did not wait for their attention. He stopped the pen, placed it flat, and spoke. "My doctors have given me months. The empire is hemorrhaging. 200 million in bad investments have gutted our reserves. The banks will seize these offices by the end of the month." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sound of a siren. Kayode let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, but the sound died quickly against his father's steady, unblinking stare. Adana froze, her thumb hovering over her screen. Chinedu sat up, the boredom vanishing from his face. The reality of the collapse hung in the air, stripping away the comfort of their positions. Victor reached into his inner pocket and withdrew 4 identical envelopes. He slid them across the polished mahogany surface, one by one. The sound of paper sliding against wood was the only noise in the room. $6,000 each, Victor announced. "That is your share of the debt." Kayode reached out, tore open the flap, and stared at the stack of bills inside. He looked up, his face reddening. "This is a joke." Victor did not blink. "No family name, no credit cards, no help from the firm. You are cut off entirely." Adana opened her envelope, her fingers trembling as she counted the cash. She looked at her father, searching for a sign of hesitation. Chinedu sat motionless, the envelope unopened before him. "If you fail, you are finished." Victor continued, his voice dropping. "The one who generates the most value inherits the chair. The rest of you will be erased from the legacy." He turned toward the window. The boardroom, once a place of privilege, had become a cage. They had 30 days to prove they were more than just names. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them, sealing the boardroom off like a tomb. For a moment, the 4 stood in the silence of the executive hallway. Kayode was the first to move, his stride long and aggressive, his jaw set in a tight line. He did not look back. He punched the elevator button repeatedly, his thumb white against the metal. Adana followed, her pace frantic, her eyes darting toward the security cameras, as if expecting a signal of support that never came. She stopped at the lobby desk, but the receptionist did not look up from her monitor. The lack of recognition hit her harder than the debt. Chinedu lingered near the water cooler, his hand shaking as he gripped the rim of a paper cup. He stared at his reflection in the dark glass of the office partitions, searching for the authority he had lost only minutes ago. Zara stood apart from them, her movements deliberate and calm. She watched her brothers and sister with a detached focus, noting the way they paced the floor. She did not reach for her phone. She did not look for an exit strategy. She simply turned toward the stairwell, choosing the path that led directly to the street level. As the elevator doors slid open for the others, the divide between them was already absolute. Kayode moved into a studio apartment by the end of the first day. The space was small, smelling of damp plaster and old paint, but he ignored the cramped walls. He looked at the stack of cash on the counter, then at his phone. He did not call a business consultant or search for a market opportunity. Instead, he sent out a flurry of invitations. He spent $3,000, half his entire stake, on premium spirits, catering, and a sound system. He believed the room was a stage, and the guests were his audience. By midnight, the apartment was packed with people he barely knew, all drinking his supply and laughing at his jokes. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands and dropping names, convinced that one of these connections would bridge the gap back to his former life. He did not notice the empty bottles piling up or the way his guests drifted toward the door as the music faded. When the last person left, the silence of the room was heavy. Kayode stood in the center of the floor, surrounded by plastic cups and cigarette ash. He checked his wallet. The remaining $3,000 felt like a failure. He had bought a night of attention, but he had not built a single thing. Adana set up her operation in a corner of a rented basement. She cleared a desk, laid out her phone, and began drafting messages. She expected the same immediate, deferential responses she had received for years. She sent out dozens of requests for samples. The first hour passed without a single notification. She refreshed her screen, her thumb moving with increasing speed. By the third hour, she tried a different approach, using a more demanding tone, citing her family name as a guarantee of payment. Still, nothing. She moved to the next list of contacts, but the results were identical. She called a supplier she had worked with for years. She sent a final, desperate message, only to see the notification that she had been blocked. She looked at her phone in the dim light. The PR team that had once managed her image was gone. Without that machinery, she was just a voice in the void. She realized then that her influence had never been her own. It was a borrowed asset reclaimed the moment she stepped out. Chinedu sat on the edge of a sagging mattress, his palms slick with sweat. He stared at the screen of his phone, the numbers flickering in the dark room. He had $6,000 left, and the pressure of the deadline was a physical weight on his chest. He looked at a list of stable, low-yield investments, then scrolled past them. A link caught his eye. A volatile, high-stakes crypto scheme promising triple returns by morning. He did not hesitate. He moved his entire stake into the account with a single, trembling tap. For the first hour, he watched the graph climb. He paced the small room, his breath shallow, imagining the victory of returning to the boardroom with doubled capital. Then, the trend reversed. The line on the screen plummeted, a jagged red descent that defied his frantic refreshes. He watched his balance drop from thousands to hundreds, then to zero. He tried to log out, to refresh, to find a support contact, but the interface remained frozen. The money was gone. He dropped the phone onto the floor and slumped back against the wall. The silence of the room was suffocating. He grabbed a bottle of cheap liquor from the floor, his hands shaking as he pried the cap off. He retreated to a friend's couch, the bottle pressed against his lips, sinking into the haze of his own failure as the reality of his total loss took hold. Zara stepped off the bus into the grit of the industrial district. The air here smelled of exhaust and raw materials. She walked until she found a hostel, its walls thin and the floorboards groaning under her weight. She paid for a bed in a cramped room, counting out the cash with deliberate, steady movements. She had $5,000 remaining. She set aside $1,000 for her business registration and kept the rest tucked away, treating every cent as a vital resource. By the next morning, she was in the heart of the local markets. She did not look for shortcuts. She walked the rows of stalls, notebook in hand, her eyes scanning the flow of goods. She watched the merchants interact with their customers, noting the rhythm of their sales and the clutter of their inventory. She stood back, silent and observant, as they struggled to keep track of their stock. She saw the frustration in their gestures when they could not find a price or a missing item. By the end of the day, she had filled half her notebook with data. She sat on a wooden crate, reviewing her notes, already calculating how to turn their chaos into a system. Zara stopped at a stall overflowing with fabric bolts and mismatched hardware. The owner, a woman with calloused hands, was frantically digging through a pile of loose receipts, her brow furrowed. Zara watched for a moment, then stepped forward. She pointed to a stack of unsorted invoices. "You are losing track of your stock because you are tracking it in your head," Zara said. The woman looked up, eyes narrowing in irritation. "I do not have time for fancy talk," she snapped, turning back to her pile. Zara did not retreat. She picked up a discarded pen and a clean page from her notebook. She spent the next hour organizing the invoices into a simple, grid-based ledger. She categorized the goods by type and arrival date, creating a clear visual map of the stall's assets. When she finished, she handed the ledger back. The woman looked at the paper, then at her own chaotic pile, and finally back at Zara. The tension in her shoulders dropped. She reached into her cash box and counted out a small, crisp fee. Zara took the money, her hands steady, and tucked it into her pocket. She had turned a mess into a process. She walked to the next stall, her notebook ready, the first real proof of her plan now firmly in her palm. The work was no longer theoretical. It was profitable. While Zara refined her ledgers, the city became a closing trap for the others. Coyote spent his nights in a rented studio, burning through his cash on parties that yielded no connections. By the 7th day, he stood in a pawn shop, sliding his watch across the counter for a fraction of its value just to pay the rent. Adana fared no better. She spent her hours firing off messages to suppliers, begging for free samples to launch her line, but her lack of a professional team left her ignored. Her inbox remained empty, and her calls were blocked one by one. Chinedu, meanwhile, was drowning in his own desperation. He poured his remaining funds into a volatile digital scheme, watching the screen as his balance plummeted to zero in a matter of hours. In the market, the atmosphere was different. Zara walked from stall to stall, her list of clients growing with every passing day. She moved with purpose, her notebook filling with growth plans and profit-tracking models. She had secured 3 new vendors by the end of the week. By the 15th day, the city center became the inevitable point of collision. Zara walked the sidewalk, her notebook tucked firmly under her arm, heading toward a meeting with a new vendor. She felt the shift in the air before she saw them. Coyote stood near a street lamp, his movements jerky and restless. Adana was pacing a few feet away, her eyes scanning the crowd with a frantic intensity. Chinedu sat on a concrete bench nearby, his hands trembling as he stared at the ground. Zara slowed her pace, her grip tightening on her bag. She had not intended to cross their path, but the narrow street left no alternative. Coyote turned, his gaze locking onto her. He stopped his pacing. Adana followed his line of sight, her expression hardening into a sharp, jagged frown. Chinedu looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the notebook in Zara's hand. The ambient noise of the city seemed to drop away. Zara kept walking, her stride steady, refusing to break her rhythm. The siblings stood motionless, watching her approach, their faces drawn and tight. Coyote moved first, stepping into Zara's path to cut off her exit. He smelled of stale smoke and desperation. He reached out, his fingers hooking into the strap of her bag, pulling hard enough to make her stumble. "Show us the names," he hissed, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and hunger. Zara held her ground, pulling the bag back against her chest, but Adana was already circling behind her. Adana held her phone high, the lens pointed directly at Zara's face, her thumb tapping the screen with rhythmic, aggressive force. "Look at the golden child," Adana shouted to the passing crowd, her voice shrill. "She thinks she is better than us because she plays nice with the vendors." Coyote ignored them, his face flushing dark. He lunged again, his hand swatting at the notebook in her grip. "You have nothing without us," he growled, his knuckles white as he shoved her shoulder. Zara did not scream. She did not plead. The standoff broke with a sudden, violent shift. Chinedu, who had been hovering at the edge of the circle, saw his opening. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He lunged forward, his hands locking onto the edges of the laptop tucked under Zara's arm. The force of his pull sent her spinning. She lost her balance, her boots sliding across the concrete, but she held on for a heartbeat. Then, the hinges groaned. Chinedu yanked with a desperate, frantic surge of strength, and the device tore free from her grip. He did not wait to see her fall. He pivoted on his heel and bolted, disappearing into the dense flow of the city crowd within seconds. Coyote and Adana stood frozen for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sudden turn of events, before they scattered in different directions. Zara remained where she was, her arms still locked in the shape of the object she no longer held. The sidewalk felt suddenly vast. She stood still, the weight of the loss settling into her bones, while the world continued to move around her as if nothing had changed. Zara turned away from the street. She did not look for Chinedu. She did not call for help. She walked 3 blocks to a stationery store, the bell above the door chiming as she entered. She bought a single, thick notebook and a handful of pens. The clerk watched her, but she ignored the gaze, her focus entirely on the blank pages ahead. She found a quiet corner in her hostel, sat at the small desk, and opened the book. The data was not gone. It was etched into her mind. She began to write. The pen moved across the paper in a steady, rhythmic flow. She reconstructed the profit-tracking models, line by line. Her hand did not shake. She stopped only to stretch her neck or to refill her water glass. The hours bled into one another. Outside, the city lights flickered and died, but inside the room, the work continued. She refined the logic until the system was stronger. By the time the sun began to bleed through the window, she closed the cover. She was ready to return to the market. Zara stepped into the market as the morning heat began to rise. She approached the first vendor, a man who had previously been hesitant to share his inventory data. She did not ask for permission. She opened her notebook, laid it flat on his counter, and pointed to a specific column of figures. She showed him how his current waste could be converted into a 20% margin increase within a week. The man frowned, his eyes scanning the numbers, but he did not pull away. He asked a question about supply logistics. Zara answered instantly, tracing a new flowchart on the back of a receipt. The man watched her pen move, then nodded and signed the agreement. She moved to the second vendor, then the third. Each interaction was faster than the last. She navigated the crowded stalls with precision, her movements efficient and purposeful. When a vendor hesitated, she offered a percentage-based growth plan, showing them the exact path to higher volume. By midday, she had secured 3 major contracts that anchored her entire operation. She found a quiet bench near the center of the market to perform a final audit. She tallied the projected returns, her pen scratching against the paper as she finalized the numbers. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Coyote entered first, his gait uneven, his hands trembling as he gripped a thick stack of overdue notices. He dropped the papers onto the mahogany surface with a dull thud. Adana followed, her face pale, her movements jerky as she tossed a list of failed promotions. She did not look at anyone, her focus fixed on the floor. Chinedu trailed behind, his eyes bloodshot, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own failure. He reached the table and pulled out a chair, the wood scraping harshly against the floor. He sat, staring at his empty hands. Then, Zara stepped into the room. She walked with a steady, measured pace. She did not rush. She did not avoid the gaze of her siblings. She moved to her chair and sat down, placing her notebook on the table with a soft, controlled click. The silence in the room deepened. The air felt thin, charged with the pressure. Coyote wiped sweat from his forehead, his breathing ragged. Adana tapped her fingers against the table, a frantic, repetitive sound. Zara sat perfectly still, her hands folded over her notebook. She looked at the head of the table, waiting. Victor rose from his seat. The movement was slow, deliberate, and commanded the entire room. He looked at the stack of notices, then at the empty hands of his children. He did not touch the papers. There was no debt, he said. His voice was steady, cutting through the heavy silence. The empire is thriving. Every account is balanced. Every investment is secure. Coyote froze, his hand hovering over the table. Adana stopped tapping her fingers. Chinedu lifted his head, his mouth slightly open. Victor continued, his gaze moving. This was a test of character. I wanted to see who would build and who would consume when the safety net was stripped away. He turned his attention to Zara. She sat motionless, her hands still resting on her notebook. You solved problems instead of creating them, Victor said. You found value where others saw only obstacles. Victor pointed toward the head of the table. The empire is yours, Zara, he declared. His tone left no room for debate. He shifted his gaze to the others, who remained frozen in their chairs. You will work under her for 1 year to earn your keep. Every task, every report, every decision will pass through her desk. Coyote opened his mouth to protest, but Victor raised a hand, silencing him instantly. There are no exceptions. If you refuse, you leave with nothing. Adana looked at the floor, her jaw tight, while Chinedu stared at the mahogany surface, his hands clenching into fists. The power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. Victor walked toward the window, looking out over the city skyline. "Legacy is not blood," he said, his voice echoing against the glass. "It is the work you do when no one is watching." He turned back to face them. "The test is over. The real work begins now." Zara stood up, her movements calm and deliberate. Zara stepped away from her chair. The sound of her footsteps on the polished floor was the only noise in the room. She walked toward the head of the table, each stride measured and purposeful. She reached the chair, placed her hands on the back, and felt the solid resistance of the wood. She did not rush. She took a breath, feeling the cool air of the office, and pulled the chair back. It slid across the floor with a low, controlled scrape. She sat down, her posture perfectly upright, and looked at the empty space where her father had stood moments before. She placed her notebook on the center of the table, aligning it with the edge. The brothers and Adana remained in their seats, watching. She opened the notebook to a fresh page, picked up a pen, and waited for the silence to settle. The boardroom felt different now. She looked up, her gaze steady, meeting each of them in turn. She tapped her pen against the table once, a sharp, rhythmic sound that signaled the start of the work. Zara began to write. The ink flowed across the page, mapping out a future built on logic rather than expectation. Outside the glass, the city moved in a chaotic blur, oblivious to the shift in power within these walls. True legacy was not found in the boardroom, but in the hours of labor spent in the quiet corners of the world. It was the ledger balanced in a dim hostel, the vendor helped in the market, the plan executed without applause. The siblings sat in the silence, forced to confront the reality that their past influence was gone. The work continued, unseen and relentless. This was the foundation of the empire, and for the first time, it was built to last.